anyone who has any kind of understanding of the law would have long said that Oscar should have known by the time that the Supreme Court increased his sentence that this case probably had zero chances of survival at the Constitutional Court.
Well, I think what was interesting was the Constitutional Court had earlier refused his application for leave to appeal his murder conviction on the basis of dolus eventualis, which was, of course, what the Supreme Court of Appeal had ultimately found. And in that case, as in this one, the court even refusing to actually hear his arguments on the issue. We understand from speaking to family members of Oscar Pistorius that he's reacted very badly to this news. I think that the realization that, you know, at the stage where this appeal was happening, he was actually looking at release within a few months, that he would have actually been released from prison and put under correctional supervision. The adding on of these years means that, instead of having that chance of getting out, he's now looking at quite a profoundly long term in jail. Of course, Reva Steenkamp's parents saying to us through their lawyer that, you know, they understand and respect that every person has the right to exhaust all legal avenues available to them, but really that, you know, for them, you know, they feel that the justice process in South Africa, they've always had faith in it, and they continue to do so. But I think the most interesting quote, of course, coming from Karyn Maughan, the prosecutor in the case, who told me, "I believe justice has been done, and I am just glad this is over."
What does it mean for the remainder of his sentence behind bars?
Well, basically, he will be eligible for parole after serving half of the sentence, and then he has to go through parole processes. I think there's going to potentially be a bit of legal pushback from his lawyers, because we know that when they argued to the Constitutional Court, they said that the court, you remember when the SCA made the determination on sentence, they said, we're subtracting the time that you've already spent. Now, his lawyers had argued that, in fact, the court had ignored an additional 1.5 years that he'd spent behind bars in Atteridgeville prison, and hadn't put together the correctional services, hadn't put together the year that he'd spent behind bars on the culpable homicide sentence. So I don't know if they can then exercise a legal option to potentially go back to the Supreme Court of Appeal and say, please consider that this needs to be taken off the sentence according to the logic that you previously applied. But on a legal basis, they really, Oscar Pistorius' lawyers, very much on the back foot here, because the highest court in the land has refused to hear their case, and I don't really know from there on where they maneuver.
What were they planning to argue before the Constitutional Court, Karyn?
Their point was on the basis of, you know, the court made a mistake, that, you know, they should have taken that 1.5 years off and didn't. They also argued that they were very unhappy with the fact that the court, the SCA, just said there were no grounds on which they could find mitigating factors for Oscar Pistorius. They didn't believe his disability, his fear, his anxiety, him believing it was an intruder, etc., etc. They just said none of these are substantial and compelling reasons justifying the imposition of a lesser sentence. So what Pistorius' lawyers did was they tried to say this is a constitutional point. There needs to be more certainty on what factors courts will actually consider when they impose minimum sentences, which we know came into effect in the 90s because government was so distraught about the level of violent crime in South Africa and believed these minimum sentences would send a strong message. But the Constitutional Court gathering in a quorum and saying, we don't, you know, we'll give you condemnation, we'll allow you to bring this application to us and we'll consider it, but we don't believe you have grounds for appeal here.
So it's certainly the end of the road for him then?
Well, absolutely. And I mean, I know that, you know, it's really up to him now how he responds to this. I know his family are very concerned. We expect some form of statement from the family members over the next 24 hours. But I mean, one also has to remember that for Reva Steenkamp's parents, as I spoke to their lawyer today, they will serve a sentence for the rest of their lives. And I think you know, it's been 5 years. You and I covered it from 2013, the mayhem, the court case being televised, everything that happened. This is probably one of the saddest chapters in terms of, you know, a South African, one-time South African hero that fell from grace. But it's something that Reva Steenkamp's family will never recover from.
You speak about the fact that, you know, essentially the ball is in his court. But what can he do? You know, what are the options that are available to him?
Well, He has tried to apologize to Reeva Steenkamp's parents. That was one of the big grounds that came up in the appeal court, where they, his lawyers said, the court, you're trying to suggest that he hasn't shown remorse, because that was the state's argument. They said, you haven't really explained what you did that night. You haven't ever really taken us into confidence. There have been multiple versions, multiple defenses, and as such, we don't believe that you have shown real remorse. And that seemed to have some form of sympathy with the SCA judges. Yeah, I mean, he's just got to deal with the fact that he's in prison, and I think, in some way or another, not give up on his possibility of, in some way, apologizing to Reeva Steenkamp's family. But I mean, that's also about their pain and their process. I remember, there can never be winners in a case like this. And I remember speaking to Reeva Steenkamp's parents' lawyers, and she said, we don't want to sound like we're celebrating this, because we have nothing to celebrate. And I think that's the cause here. There are no winners in this situation. There are only losers. A young woman lost her life. Someone who had an incredibly bright future in front of them literally has disintegrated that future. And there's no kind of joy for anyone. It's just a process of, how do you come back from this if you can?
So if I understand you correctly, because the legal bit has almost been exhausted fully, it is now about what rests on a man's conscience, as it were, and being able to finally build that bridge. And it's an apology that the family has rejected before. So with the passage of time, perhaps there's still a hope from Oscar Pistorius that they might come to accept that apology. I
think that's something that he's very hopeful about. And we remember he gave that apology in court, and, they've said that they forgive him, but they still seem to not be satisfied with the explanation that he's given. In the prison process, he has options to do courses, he has options to study, he has options to really, in his own behavior, demonstrate, kind of appreciation of the seriousness of his circumstances, and really try and deal in the space that he is. Correctional services does tend to be sympathetic to people who show real effort in terms of their own rehabilitation, and he has options within the prison system, within the parole system itself, to really demonstrate that he is someone who can be let back into society, and the jail is not necessarily the best place for him. But there is so much vitriol and anger and hatred that surrounds this case, that the kind of public discourse that surrounds it is going to always be an immense challenge to him, because many people, as we've seen again and again, don't accept his explanation, believe that he cold-bloodedly killed this young woman, despite a court actually saying that that was not the case. All right. Well, the court has said he did the crime, and I guess right now it's about doing the time, as it were, and really no options available to him. Specialist legal reporter Karyn Maughan in studio with me.